Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. Perhaps one of the most hotly debated topics among Christians after the plan of salvation is the topic of divorce and remarriage. Does God allow divorce and remarriage at all? In limited cases? Or in all cases? Are the teachings of Paul at odds with the teachings of Jesus? Or do they in some way nullify or even trump the teachings of Jesus? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul deals with the topic of divorce. But let's remember that he's doing so in the context about marriage during times of persecution. Knowing this will prevent us from taking some wrong views on the topic. So if you have a Bible with you, you can turn now to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to be reading verses 10 to 16. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning at verse 10. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean. But now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. But God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? I cannot say this enough. The question Paul is answering is about marriage during times of persecution. Is it okay to get married during times of persecution? Which in the last lesson we learned was yes, but it might be better to remain unmarried if you could do so without being tempted to commit fornication. This section deals with those who are already married. Is it okay to remain married during times of persecution? And the answer to that, again, was yes. But unlike to the unmarried, where Paul was giving inspired advice about it being better to remain unmarried if possible, in verse 10, Paul is not telling the married it is better to remain married. No, he is saying the Lord commands them to remain married. A wife is not to depart from her husband, meaning divorce her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. Marriage is not something that is to be entered into lightly, where we cast off our spouse on a whim. When we marry someone, we're committing to remain married to them until one of us dies, at which point Romans 7 verse 2 tells us that marriage is over. If, however, divorce does happen, then the man and the woman is to remain unmarried or be reconciled. Now, from this passage, there are some things taught that are wrong and come from a misunderstanding of the context. And one of those mistaken teachings is that Christians can never divorce and remarry, not even when one spouse commits adultery against the other. The reasoning goes, Paul does not mention Jesus' exception clause found in Matthew 19, verse 9, so therefore, Paul's teaching somehow trumps Jesus' teaching, or somehow Jesus' teaching applied only to the betrothal part of the Jewish custom of marriage, and so, for Christians today, nobody can ever divorce and remarry, even in cases of adultery. But just so we know exactly what Jesus said, let's reread Matthew 19, verse 9. And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. This verse should not be hard to understand, even though people make it hard. It is a commandment of Jesus. I say to you. There can be no commandment of Jesus that the apostles can later come along and trump. Yes, sometimes Jesus commented on the Mosaic law, a law we're not under, but Jesus isn't commenting on that law in this chapter. He's making a new law. Therefore, Matthew 19, verse 9 is as much for the kingdom as 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11 is. And as such, they must agree. What does Matthew 19:9 say? If someone divorces his spouse, except if the divorce is for fornication, adultery, and married another, then they commit adultery. And if you marry someone who is put away, for whatever reason, you commit adultery. The necessary implication of that is that if you divorce your spouse for fornication and marry another, you do not commit adultery. Now, for some, this implication is hard to see, but it shouldn't be. For if that isn't what Jesus meant. He would have simply said if someone divorces their spouse and marries another, they commit adultery. By providing this one exception, a narrow one at that, Jesus gives permission for a divorced person to remarry, but in that situation only. Spousal abuse, neglect, or any other reason other than adultery is not included, and thus if a person married again after divorce for those reasons, they would commit adultery. That's pretty cut and dry. But the exception clause is not found in Mark 10's account of the same event. No, it isn't. But notice, Jesus' response in Matthew 19 is in public to the Pharisees, while his response in Mark 10 is in private to the disciples. Therefore, the context in which the response is given is not exactly the same. Jesus' general teaching, marriage is for life, no divorce and remarriage. Jesus' specific teaching leaves open remarriage in one specific instance, adultery, and even then, only for the one who put away their spouse for adultery. If that's the case, why didn't Paul mention that here in 1 Corinthians 7? Because Paul's talking about marriage in times of persecution. To those already married, if they put away their spouse because it was easier to be unmarried during times of persecution than married, that wouldn't fit into Jesus' exception. And so, not only could they not remarry, but they shouldn't even consider divorce. They were married and should remain married. If a spouse was rash and did divorce their spouse for whatever reason, then both are to remain unmarried in the hopes that reconciliation could be had. All of this teaches us an important truth. When divorce occurs, sin is always present. Sometimes sin is present through the actions of one spouse, sometimes both, but it's always present. What about in cases of spousal abuse? Is Paul saying that a wife needs to remain in an abusive relationship and shouldn't seek divorce? What did we discuss back in chapter 6? Spousal abuse is against the law, and so if your spouse can't or won't change their behavior, going to the police is the proper thing to do. Separation from said spouse until and unless their behavior changes is also warranted. God does not demand that we remain in an abusive relationship simply because we're married to the person. But leaving and doing nothing should not be our desire. Seek help from the law enforcement. Seek counseling. Seek change so that if possible, reconciliation can happen. But if it can't, remain unmarried. Paul's teaching agrees with Jesus' teaching, and the reason the exception of Matthew 19:9 is not mentioned is because it's not under consideration here. What happens if my spouse is not a Christian? Does that change things? For a Christian, no. Paul said if the unbelieving spouse would be willing to live with the believing spouse, then by all means remain married, for that's what Christ wants. What Paul is saying here are instructions that he had received from the Lord, but that the Lord had not directly taught while on earth, which is what verse 12 means when Paul says, "But to the rest I, not the Lord, says." And those instructions are that marriage is an honorable institution, even if both partners are not Christians, and as such, the believing spouse sanctifies the unbelieving spouse. In other words, the marriage is still holy before God, for if it wasn't, then the children would be unclean. They would be born as if out of wedlock. This sanctification is not salvific, for verse 16 says that by staying married, the believer might actually save the unbeliever through their example. The sanctification here concerns the marriage itself. The marriage is still holy even though one spouse is an unbeliever. Why did this need to be pointed out? Because there might have been some in Corinth that taught something along the lines of marriage to an unbeliever is not really marriage. This marriage might have come about when both were unbelievers, and then one became a Christian, or it might have come about because a believer married an unbeliever. This passage is ambiguous concerning that, showing us that, while unwise, it is not necessarily sinful to marry an unbeliever. Christians should be warned about the pitfalls of doing so. They should be advised to consider carefully. But in the end, unlike what some people might teach, a Christian does not sin by marrying an unchristian as long as both have the right to marry in the first place. This is something we'll discuss again towards the end of the chapter. What happens if the unbelieving spouse won't remain? Then the believer is to let them depart, for they are not under bondage in such cases, for God has called us to peace. What does that mean? Does that give us another exception, abandonment or neglect, where the believing spouse may remarry? Let me ask you, where did Paul say anything about remarriage? He tells the believing spouse that they are not under bondage to go after their unbelieving spouse in order to force them to remain in the marriage. The passage says nothing about remarriage, nor is the bondage here the marriage bond, for marriage is not a master-slave relationship. The bondage is a commandment from the Lord to force the unbeliever to remain. The Corinthians were following Jesus' teachings to remain married, but unbelievers are not always going to follow the teachings of Jesus, for if they did, they would be believers. One cannot force someone to do the will of Christ, especially if that will lead to hardship because of persecution on the part of the believer. And that is what really is the point. Why does Paul think the unbeliever would depart? From the context, I don't believe it is just for any reason, though really it makes no difference, for the teaching would be the same. Rather, I believe Paul has in mind that the unbeliever would depart in order not to be persecuted along with their believing spouse for something they personally don't believe in. Paul tells the Christian that if the unbeliever is adamant to leave, you're only going to cause a war, a large fight, by insisting they remain. And since God called you to be peacemakers, allowing them to leave is allowed. But nowhere is it implied in this section or the next one the believer can remarry in this case. Verses 10 and 11 still apply. Remain unmarried or be reconciled. So from this section, there are two diametrically opposed false teachings that we need to be aware of. No divorce and remarriage for any cause, for Jesus gives us one in Matthew 19:9, and divorce and remarriage for the cause of abandonment. Paul doesn't mention that here. In truth, if people simply followed God's instructions about loving our spouse and honoring our roles in marriage, there would be a lot less people desiring a divorce. But we don't live in that type of society, and so divorce is rampant. We as Christians, however, need to follow the truth as found in God's Word. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 to 28, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.